Hey everyone, this is the SIG Auth meeting for October 16th, 2019. We don't have that much in the agenda, but audit policy is there, and I know there's a lot of discussion to be had around it. But Mike, I believe you added the announcements. Would you like to take that? Are you talking, Mike?
He said come back to him.
Oh, he said come back. Okay. Um, so Tim and Gregory, you guys had the dynamic audit policy?
Yep. Can you hear me? Guys?
You're a little bit quiet, but I can hear you.
I'll try to talk louder. Okay, so that's. I wanted to make a kind of recap what we did so far, where we are, and kind of ask for some guidance how to proceed here. So the dynamic policy part of the dynamic backend started at least the first recorded PR around this was sometime in November 2018. So it's already got some history in trying to get it out. Then at some point of time, I joined to try to reinforce the whole thing and made an implementation for that. Later on, there was an API review meeting somewhere in July, I believe, if I recall correctly, where we decided that we need to elaborate further the use cases and reevaluate the whole thing and how do we select resources for auditing and so on. We did that. So one of the things that came out of this effort was a Google Doc, a publicly shared Google Doc that basically contains some cooperative comments around this thing and briefly outlined some possible use cases that we need to take a look at. Sometime, I think by the end of August, there was also another document on the line that was publicly shared. It was kind of a design draft as a first attempt to wrap up all the discussions that we had so far and see how to proceed with some suggestions for design and so on. Again, it contains some interesting cooperative comments inside. And some weeks later, this folded into a CAP, Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal, and an accompanying supplementary document that has more details than the CAP in case to clarify the whole thing. So during this period, there has been quite interesting ideas how to approach the whole thing. We had back and forth conversations and implementations around mainly how to select resources, what would be the most convenient for the end users and to avoid some mistakes from the past. And on the other hand, we had some discussions and that are still open around who does what and how to exactly separate things, especially in the much more rich in roles scenarios that we are currently looking with, because probably initially things started around normal hosted cluster, but then we added to the scene also managed clusters and so on, which make things more complicated. Also, the community contributed also interesting use cases and roles where you have also separation between the say an administrator and an operator within a managed cluster and that kind of stuff. So it's pretty interesting and abundant in scenarios topic, which of course makes it kind of complex thing to tackle. One of the issues that I've had so far was that apart from the fact that we are improving, we kind of seem to progress, and at some point of time, we scratch everything and start once again, which does not draw us any closer to releasing something around that and trying the whole thing out into the wild. So I would like to just ask you, do you have any ideas how to proceed here in some more constructive way or something?
I'm confused. Are you saying that Tim's comments 2 days ago about how he may want to reconsider this, are you asking to not reconsider that? Or are the comments not clear?
I think it's probably more a question, like, this has been going on for multiple releases, and it's about the time it feels like an approach has been thought through. It's suggested that maybe it doesn't address a lot of fundamental use cases, and we kind of start over. And so I'm sympathetic to that question. I think it's more a question of, like, if we want to start over, what's going to make this different than the last 2 times we started over?
Yeah, that's kind of my question.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I would certainly prefer not to throw this away. I think my comments were a bit more rambly than I would have liked, but I was trying to just kind of understand what some of the fundamental issues that we were trying to solve here were, and sort of musing about how this solves them. And also trying to think of, in general, when a feature is having trouble moving forward, that's usually a good sign that it's we're trying to tackle too much at once. And so I was trying to think about, are there any ways that we can break this problem down into smaller chunks that are more easily addressable? I don't know if that's true. But I did have some other thoughts that I wanted to share, if we want to go into that now.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it. We can go into this.
I also just do want to say, like, if people think of something that means we need to reassess this, I'm disinclined to say, well, no, we've talked about this so long, let's just do what we've talked about. These look like valid concerns to me.
I'm not saying that at all. But I do think it's worth asking before we kind of reboot the discussion, like, why do we think we ended up here, and can we maybe try to avoid that? So maybe it is asking more fundamental questions. Maybe it is trying to pick smaller pieces that we don't envision needing to grow in really complex ways. I think some of the initial attempts came up with an API that could start simple, but we could see it needing to get a lot more complicated in the future. And that kind of started this endless attempt to predict the future and predict all the complex ways it would need to grow. So maybe that's kind of a thing we could do differently, like try to tackle pieces that wouldn't need to grow in complexity in the future. We could imagine them combining with other simple pieces to address future use cases. So yeah, David, I don't think this is an attempt to say, let's not start back at the beginning, but more just a question of, if we do start over, how will we start over in a different way so we can actually make some progress?
Okay, that's fine. I mean, I'm sure Tim would not let himself be ignored. I wanted to make sure we were, yeah, fair.
That's it. By the way, all the comments that Tim has made are wonderful. Actually, his last idea is also very interesting. Can I suggest, if you have the time, if we can sit together, maybe online, and with focused effort, we can achieve actually more than offline and via GitHub.
Yeah, I definitely agree. My hope is that that's sort of what we're doing now. You know, if we need to meet more than every 2 weeks and make room for other SIG Auth agendas, then we can schedule additional meetings. But yeah, I agree that to move this forward, it's definitely going to require a bit more than bi-weekly comment responses on GitHub.
So otherwise, it totally makes sense if we can simplify the thing to make a breakdown. The concern that I have is that when we're doing this, we also have to keep in mind the big picture so that we don't do a patchwork at the end, so that the pieces are synchronized.
Yeah. So I think going back to Jordan's question of sort of how did we get here, when we were thinking about use cases for this dynamic audit policy, I think we sort of started with, okay, we have this audit policy. What are the use cases for manipulating this audit policy? And I think that was the wrong starting point. And I think that's kind of what led to getting stuck here. And so I just wanted to kind of back up and talk about what is the point of an audit policy at all? Like, why not just send every single request to in full to the backend? And the two pieces that I was able to come up with there, one is just an optimization that we're sending less data to the backend and filtering out some of the noise, and then the backend has to store less of the data. The storage piece I'm a little less worried about because we could also do that server side. And then the second use case that I came up with was filtering out sensitive information either for security or compliance reasons that shouldn't show up in the audit logs at all. So that's where we say, like, we shouldn't be sending secrets to the audit logs. And we set that request to metadata. And there's sort of a third piece, which is if we're talking about multi-tenant logging, that kind of gets into the sensitivity. I would argue that for now, let's leave multi-tenant audit logging out of the picture. And perhaps we can solve that problem out of tree in a different way. Are there any kind of thoughts on that framing of the problem, or if there are other purposes for an audit policy that we should consider?
I remember you raised the point about using the audit focus debug facility. Is this the last thing that you mentioned, or it's a completely different use case?
Well, I would say the debugging piece isn't, I don't think that's a motivation for audit policy, because if we sent every request to the audit backend, then that would work well for the debugging case.
Like you could filter discard at the recipient side.
Yeah.
So that kind of reduces to the performance aspect or the security aspect, for the two reasons you wouldn't want to just do the filtering on the receiving side.
Yeah. And maybe just to clarify, like, why I think that this is a good starting point for this discussion, this is where we are today, where we have this sort of like top level, just kind of send everything at a certain filter level to the back end. And so the question is sort of, why do we want to build this into Kubernetes as opposed to continuing to just say, do the filtering on the server side for the audit logging backend? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I really follow the security argument. Can you maybe explain that a bit more? So you mentioned secrets. Are we talking about like the request body of like creating a secret, or like what kind of like are we talking about here?
Yeah, viewing contents of incoming requests and
Okay.
contents of outgoing responses.
Okay, and are we also considering like at debug level, when someone was debugging and the kind of logs up really high and we accidentally log some tokens into the logs, is that also kind of the sort of thing we're thinking about, or is that a separate concern that we're not considering?
The audit log doesn't include like request headers. So
Okay.
it's limited to API request response bodies,
Okay.
and then the metadata, but not request headers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so not wanting secret content to end up in the audit logs is one. I was sort of thinking like maybe for compliance reasons, if you have, the way that you store your audit logs doesn't have the same compliance regulations on it as what you, like where you store your database, then maybe you might want to filter out potentially potential PII or something like that from the audit logs. But the secret, I think the secrets case is the only concrete one that I can think of. The other ones are sort of hypothetical.
Yeah, and is there some sort of CRD at angle to this as well too? Like,
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that sort of gets at the kind of the fundamental motivations for having an audit policy in the first place. And then there's a few different properties that we would desire on the audit policy. For those properties, the main one is that it should be secure. So we don't want an attacker to be able to cover their tracks by manipulating the audit policy. And we sort of get that today through the static audit policy because it's a static file on the master that can't be manipulated through the API. If your attacker has access to that file, that's bad news already. And then the other piece is, which sort of gets into the original motivation for splitting up this policy into these audit classes, which is we'd like this to be extensible. So when thinking about like the optimization piece or the sensitivity of CRDs, the people who are going to know which of those requests are just noise or expected are going to be the ones deploying those objects and workloads, not the cluster admin. And so we would like the users who are deploying these things to be able to set some sort of policy on those to say, this is noise or this is sensitive. So that was kind of how I was breaking down that problem there.
Two things come from my mind. Could it be that there is different perception to what is important and what is noise to different roles? Like the same resource could it be that it can be perceived by the administrator as something important, and there's noise by the operator, and who sets the correct level then? And the other thing is, I was thinking about your proposal here. If we use the resources themselves to annotate these things, there won't be a central place where you can look into and reason what's the actual case, what's your policy, no matter how you call it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not going to be very comprehensible probably. Or you could argue, of course, that if you're interested particularly for what is your policy with regards, for example, secrets, you're just going to look into some special annotation property, or I don't know how are you going to realize this for secrets, and you're going to know.
Yeah, so I think we're kind of skipping ahead a little bit towards the like the solution, which I'd like to talk about, but also I want to kind of nail down the problems we're trying to solve a little more first. Sorry, what was your first question? Was if what is noise is defined differently in different contexts. If the admin considers it important and the operator considers it noise,
or vice versa. So like the RBAC audit to RBAC consumer of audit logs is a good example. Like it really wants to know every single request that a particular user made so that it can make a policy that covers that, or a role that covers that. And so like creation of events is probably something an admin considers noise, right? Because it happens all the time, and they're just informative, and they get thrown away after an hour, and it doesn't matter. So they're probably going to filter that out. But if I'm making a role for a controller, I really want to know that it tried to create event objects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with the noise piece, I think that a backend should always be able to raise, say, give me more.
Opt into more noise.
Yeah. Thinking about it just from an optimization perspective, right? If I'm saying I can handle it, send me everything. I guess there's an argument for the load that places on the API server.
It's also costs, by the way. I have a really concrete use case. If you're sending to a very expensive service that is actually scrambling those solids and doing some funny stuff with them for threat detection, I don't know, forensics and so kind of stuff, then costs can be significant.
Right, but I was saying per backend, like when I register a new backend, I think I should always be able to say, give me more.
Specifically around like noise, like not necessarily things that are sensitive.
Yeah, not on the sensitivity dimension, but on the noise dimension.
Like if the cluster administrator said sensitive things aren't allowed to be sent across the audit.
Yeah.
To audit webhooks. An audit webhook couldn't say, no, really, send me sensitive things.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to write down some breadcrumb notes in the just so we don't forget and have to rewatch the video of this.
Yeah, I think we're paying X cents or dollars per log line. I guess it's cents. It's definitely a thing, and you could say, well, you just need to put a filtering backend in front of that backend, which is possible for some people, I guess, but also a fairly large burden. So I wonder if some of these use cases could be solved by having the acceptable level of noise chosen, based on business requirements of how much you're willing to spend on log retention and analysis systems and whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
But you can kind of time-bound temporarily increase them for if there's something in particular you're doing right now. And I wonder if that might be enough. So the audit to RBAC case, I think, kind of clean example there, maybe.
Yeah, so I guess how I was thinking about this was, suppose that the audit event has some data on it that says, this is this level of sensitivity and this level of noisiness. And then the backend, per backend policy could just look like, what level of sensitivity am I allowed and what level of noise can I tolerate? And you can almost think of it, the noise piece is almost like the log levels that we have today. So the verbosity level. And so I could say, yes, send me everything. I don't care about request and response bodies. So you can always drop that level of detail down. And so, yeah, I guess then the policy has sort of this knob for level of detail, a knob for level of noise, and sensitivity is sort of a separate piece.
For sensitivity, would it just be request and response contents? Like would metadata always be able to be sent?
Yeah,
And by metadata, I mean like name, not like labels, annotations.
yeah, metadata as by the audit definition, not by
Right.
metadata on the object.
Request info, how about that? Because I could definitely see problems if someone installing a webhook thought that they had a picture of activity in the cluster. Like it's really different if a audit hook gets an audit event that says this user made this request, and due to cluster policy, I can't show you the body of the request. Like that at least gets sent to the webhook, and they know that the request occurred, and they know that they weren't sent the content.
Yeah.
That's different than nothing gets sent to them because the cluster admin said, nope, secrets can't be sent.
Yeah.
So I'm having a hard time understanding this a little bit. Are we saying that if you declare a resource as sensitive, it will, like the cluster admin declares it, say for secrets? Does that mean that no matter what the configuration of the actual audit backend is, there's no way for it to get the body? Maybe it wants it for some reason?
We're not sure about mechanisms. We're trying to explore like what is the right balance between controls that the cluster admin has around performance and sensitivity characteristics and controls that the webhook registration has for like exfiltrating data and putting load on the API server.
Okay, I was just thinking in my head if sensitivity is a property of the webhook partially at least, or is it always just the pure property of the resource?
It's an interesting question, Micah. If audit of some things, partial audit.
Is it worth even calling it audit? Like it's almost a misnomer that's like leading to confusion here. Like if it was event stream or, you know what I mean? Like more clearly in the name specifying that this is not complete and auditable streams of data.
Yeah, maybe. I think figuring out what we want, like what the use cases are and who should have control. And yeah, then we'll pick a great name because naming is easy.
Yeah, exactly.
Also thinking about sensitivity on the object. Suppose that we said that sensitivity was a property, like kind of what I was proposing before. If sensitivity was just, say, an annotation on the API object. What I don't want to be able to do is say, I'm going to create a privileged pod that takes over the node that it runs on, and I'm going to label this as sensitive, so you won't actually see the body of that pod. So sensitivity, I think, shouldn't always be in control of the user creating or owning the object.
Right. I at first glance, I sort of expected that to be something the cluster admin would specify. Like if the intent is to keep someone with high levels of access to the API from being able to cover their tracks or exfiltrate data based on the desires of the person who set up the cluster, then I don't think I would expect the controls around sensitivity to be part of the API. It seems like that would be part of like the static policy today. Like when you set up a cluster, you say, I consider these things sensitive, mask the bodies when you send them to webhooks. I don't know.
Yeah, CODs get kind of interesting there though, right? Because like, I'm a developer, I made this COD, I put a super sensitive thing in there. How do I tell the system not to log it?
Yeah, it almost feels like the sensitivity is a property of the resource. So in the case of CRD, you might be able to say, what is the sensitivity of the CRD? And then for the built-in types, have some sort of mechanism for.
It's a super complicated algorithm. Says, is the name secret? Maybe.
Well, I mean, being able to indicate that a CRD, when you created it, is sensitive would be really useful for something like encryption at rest.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see generic value in the idea of this resource is sensitive or has sensitive content.
Yeah, and if you don't let it be changed, or you like have controls around how it can be changed, like you wouldn't have to worry about, like I set up a CRD and I said it was sensitive, and then somebody came along later and said, oh no, it's not sensitive, or flip it around the other way and to mask my tracks. I don't know. Yeah, I think putting it at the level of the resource author. So for the built-in things, either making a determination saying secrets are sensitive and other things are not, or tying it to the things that are encrypted at rest, maybe, or having a separate control. I don't know. For CRD, I could see it being on the CRD object, I guess.
I mean, if you put it on CRD for the built-ins, isn't that roughly the equivalent on putting it on like the REST storage?
Yeah.
Are we veering a little too far into the mechanism discussion? Or are we ready for that?
I think it would be helpful to kind of look back through the use cases that got enumerated and say, like, looking at it this way in terms of noise dimensions or security dimensions.
Mm-hmm. Are there other dimensions that are missing?
Maybe. Like the, I think where we got into the weeds a lot was with selection of particular resources.
Yeah.
Like auditing a particular user or a particular group seems a lot more clear cut than like, I want to include this resource but exclude that resource, but include this namespace but exclude that namespace. Maybe that's just because my bias from how I want to use this API.
Mm-hmm.
I generally get the feel that we're kind of doing a lot of speculation without customers, like, or let's say users. And the people who originally proposed this, like, are you the users, or are you like kind of building this on behalf of people who would use it? Like, if we were to come up with a set of proposals, like, who are we going to take them to and say, validate it and say, oh, like, this is what we think, like, would this actually meet what you're trying to do?
I think we tried to do that with some of the use cases, but I think some of them were speculative still.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if we can, we might be able to track down some folks who actually work on digital forensics and get them to take a look at this.
Well, yeah, I think there's a balance there too. Like, I think that if you ask a forensics person, I would just say, give me all the logs for all the things forever. At least that would be the Google answer, right? Like that's what we do. We just take as many logs as we can, stuff them into a giant like log analysis pipeline, and then keep them like depending on what the data is. But like if it's something that like for a corporate network or something that we might want to do an investigation on later, then we keep them for quite a while. So.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we use them for debugging our clusters, and it is we want to see everything in every namespace, and I'm probably not going to keep the content for most of it, but I will see the flow of that things are really bad right here. But I've also heard of people who would like to in their namespace say, "Hey, I wonder what happened to me in my namespace." And I don't personally know those people. I've never been that person. But that's usually where I've heard I need the per namespace selection to happen. And I am heavily biased to make a backend figure that out if you want to.
Yeah, thinking about the debug cases, there's definitely the show me everything going on in this namespace. There's show me every request that this service account has made. And I think there's show me every operation or request against or on this specific object or resource. I still sort of feel like all of the debugging use cases could be handled server-side. Like everything we just named.
Yeah, because we're saying that we have a trusted sync. Basically.
Right, exactly. If you trust your sync with everything.
Yeah. And if you don't, then...
And if your API server can keep up with exporting audit events, like full request response audit events for every request at the rate at which it's processing.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
For the trusting your sync, would just saying that there was such thing as a namespace audit sync address that use case?
As I said, I'm heavily biased towards making a backend deal with this, where I would say I would expect someone to set up their sync, and if they want to distribute to a namespace level sync, they can forward on wherever they want. If they want to put it in one spot and then enforce some sort of rule for querying the aggregation engine, they could do that. But I would like to stay out of the business of doing it if we could.
Mm-hmm. That's getting a little more into the like multi-tenant audit logging case that I said at the beginning. Like, I'd like to avoid thinking about that. I guess that's where you say like, okay, well, what if we have these different audit syncs and we don't trust them with all the data?
Yeah, and I'm saying that if we just say we aren't going to solve that,
yeah,
then it becomes a problem for the back end to deal with, and we don't mess with it. I could live with that outcome.
Mm-hmm. Then you can just build a an in-cluster audit multiplexer or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, technically, this entire proposal could be done that way, right? Like,
yeah,
you could actually demonstrate a fully working piece of function, and never have to provide this functionality in the same.
And that's been our answer to date.
The difference today is that you have a static policy that is informing your file-based and single static webhook-based audit logs. And today that is also informing any dynamically registered audit syncs. And so
is
that
true? I thought we just had a top level audit level for dynamic syncs.
Yeah, the static policy does not influence the dynamic backend.
Oh, does it not?
No.
Oh, okay.
It's totally isolated.
Yeah.
Okay. Then never mind.
Yeah, I think
the point is really that with the proposal you can have the cluster providers having their own thing completely secure and isolated with the static policy, and you can have also the users of the clusters, who could be administrators or something else, to impose their own policy as per their organization compliance rules.
it would be hard to implement something based on annotations on the objects out of tree unless you were getting request response level for every object. But sure, I guess you could just do that.
If you wanted like object level indications of confidentiality and things like that.
Object
Yeah,
level.
for something that was implemented out of tree though, if everything is getting sent to that sink and that sink is trusted, and it's going to redistribute based on filtering things, or like you can configure that thing to say don't log secrets and don't do something with this custom resource and that custom resource.
Mm-hmm.
Have we considered trying out these policies as a CRD and sync implementation that receives everything and then filters based on these things?
I think the original author, was that Patrick? Yeah, I think he implemented an in-cluster audit proxy that just took the existing audit policy and applied it.
Yeah, so like the dynamic addition and removal of a sink, like that lets someone using the cluster make use of audit information distinct from the person who set up the cluster. So that seems useful. The detailed filtering and potential redistribution of like namespace filtered things or user filtered things, or that is what is that starts to get really complex and would be nice to defer because there are so many different use cases. Coming up with one true API to describe them all is difficult, as we've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have like a debug use case, you really don't care about like 99% of this API. You're going to do something like grab everything, or grab everything from one namespace, or grab everything from one user, and that's all you need. What would it look like to pursue just the sensitivity aspect? Like to me, that's the one that is the most thorny, because that's like actual data disclosure that the cluster admin doesn't want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a good starting point. Thinking about just breaking the problem down and tackling it one piece at a time.
Yeah, I see that metadata is valuable in general for multiple reasons, but it could inform something like dynamic audit policy, but it would be distinct from it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've had a request for encrypt all the resources that are sensitive at rest, and then had I wonder which ones those are when you add CRDs.
Yep. If we did that, would we, the Kubernetes developers, make a hard-coded decision for built-in resources, or would we want users to have control of that?
I have not built the API in my head yet. I would be thinking about something like a field on CRDs and something in discovery overall, so that it was a discoverable trait, so that way aggregated API servers could also participate. But I have not thought through all the implications of what that does.
It's also slightly not too little too late, but if we're concerned about people with basically super user access to the API, being able to intercept bodies of requests, we have admission webhooks, and they do a really good job of that today. So if you have super user access to the API and can register an admission webhook, you can get at least write requests to arbitrary resources. So not that we shouldn't think about this for audit, because audit includes read requests and things like that. But just recognizing where we are already at with what is controllable via the API.
Yeah, read access shouldn't be discounted though, right? Like we have synthetic resources in OpenShift that allow you to inspect secrets related to X as a sub-resource, right? And they aren't realized in cluster. It's a strict read API.
Okay.
Yeah, and you certainly want to audit who has accessed a secret in general.
Yeah, I see it as like a canonical, I have a sensitive resource. I definitely want to see who accessed it. I definitely don't want to see the content.
Yep. Okay, so should we talk about next steps here?
Yes.
I guess action items that we've come up with so far are revisit the use cases in all of the different audit KEPs and see if this breakdown applies.
Did we want a CRD-based implementation of various attempts at an API?
I mean, certainly nothing is stopping anyone from going and doing that today.
Like I look at that and say, then if that means there's something that we really need to pick up, it should probably already exist somewhere, right?
Yeah. Or if it can't be built in that way, then what is stopping it? Like, what is the missing core piece that would let that happen?
Well, I meant in the sense that you use a sync that is trusted, you send everything to it, and then have a CRD that lets you manipulate some subset of that sync, kind of what you said earlier.
Just from my experience, having reviewed and looked at some of the performance issues with the static policy and been involved in like filtering out noise there, my guess would be performance would be the reason that wouldn't work well in general. On a busy cluster, sending audit events for everything and doing back-end filtering, it's very significant what gets sent. So like today, like with the controls available today, we don't even have noise controls. So I think you would run into trouble very quickly on a cluster of any significant size.
Even if you're just sending the metadata request info level?
Probably, but there are use cases that require more than metadata. And so if we're saying you could solve a lot of use cases without needing any changes to what we have today, I don't think that would be, some of them certainly, but I think it's trouble performance-wise. But quantifying that, or seeing how difficult it would be to get some of the simpler use cases, I think you could get some mileage out of. Small to medium clusters. Most clusters are not gigantic. Most of them are small to medium, and so knowing what you could do with the tools we have today would be helpful. It's hard to ask someone to go spend a lot of time and effort on it, though, if we're pretty sure they're going to run into.
Well, for things like this is what the APIs look like, this is how you use them, this is how they function, and this is how I solve these problems, you could build something that would not be throwaway.
That's true. The API design, like actually exercising these APIs and these filters and seeing.
And the implementation of it, right? If you write it in Go, you could more or less pull it in. I think that we could see an essentially complete feature that just had scale issues, and we would be bringing it in to fix the scale issues because they were identified and clearly described.
To run the filtering before it got sent across the wire instead of after.
Correct. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be interested and try to help drive the shape of that API. Like, this discussion was really useful for me. It just means that like nothing is stopping progress here. All right, I don't see how it's stopping progress here.
Is there a follow-up action item around the sensitivity discussion?
It sounded like that was interesting to several people for lots of reasons. So probably.
Yeah, I bet you could find API machinery people who are interested in that. And
how convenient that some of them are on this call.
Funny how that works, huh?
Yeah, from what I gathered on that, I think one of the interesting questions was, does the cluster admin get any choice in if something is sensitive or not? And certainly where all the pieces live, like how they show up in configure or whatever.
Tim, did you want to take the first item?
Or maybe Georgie, would you be interested in exploring that?
So I just need to wrap my head around what we have discussed today, so that I'm sure I understand. How can I assess that?
Yeah, I can certainly help with that.
Okay.
The first item, and yeah, if you have any questions or parts of the discussion you didn't follow, feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, I will need.
Great. Any other thoughts on this topic before we move on?
Oh, we have 2 minutes left.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Say your 2 seconds, man.
These are going to be really quick, and we can dive in next meeting. So I'll do the credential provider extraction one first. I think this is probably interesting to the people here. This is just a cap, so we can discuss it after. We'll have a chance to review it. And then the first announcement was I'm working on adding OSS Fuzz coverage to some of our serializers. There's already set up for set up for YAML, SIG YAML and YAML v2, and those run under OSS Fuzz. The targets are in the test fuzz directory. I'm going to add a lot of documentation on how to write your own tests, but if you do write tests, they'll get run a lot of times continuously in that directory. That's the eventual goal. So let me know if you're interested in learning more, and I will go into more detail maybe next meeting.
Can you throw links onto that?
Yes.
That'd be great.
Mike, you can go into it more next time, but what is OSS Fuzz?
OSS Fuzz is a project that runs continuous fuzzing on a very large cluster. I think there's about 25,000 machines. It's part of Chromium Security, and they like to fuzz open source projects. So if we write targets, they will throw random data at them, and they find a lot of bugs, and it's free, so we should do it. And I think that we've had a number of incidents that might have been helped with a little better fuzzing, maybe the JSON path one and maybe the most recent YAML one, but not sure till we try it. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I had a feeling it was something like that, but
Yeah.
I didn't want to assume.
Just as a point of reference, this caught a breaking JSON change in Go 1.13 before it was released. So that's cool.
Yeah, so looking forward for people to write targets. It's not easy now because there's no documentation, but I'll add that. And then building nice corpuses. Luckily, Jordan built a really nice one in chaos.io test data that I'm going to use for some of the initial targets. And then I have a doc that has some potential targets that I will also publish to give people a starting point that are interested in writing targets.
Cool, thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
All right, we are out of time. Does anyone have anything before we close off? Thank you, guys. That was a great discussion. And let's maybe the third time is the charm for audit policy. Let's hope. Bye, guys. See you.
Hopefully.